Good evening. I'm Craig Dumont with PentecostalPastor.com, and with me is Dr. Brian Peterson. Dr. Peterson is the professor of Old Testament at Lee University, also Hebrew as well, but also quite an expertise in ancient Near East culture, and a lot of work even over the Middle East in terms of archaeology. And he has written a number of excellent books, Ezekiel, in context, John's use of Ezekiel, which we covered in depth in one of our conversations. I know that you've got an Old Testament commentary that's going to be coming out. You've got some other works. As Bill Simmons, a gentleman who's been doing some videos, this guy writes some great stuff, and it's just amazing, the production. In fact, this book that you have written now is called Genesis as Torah. And here I am sitting here coveting the fact that you're able to put this kind of stuff out, and I'm stuck back on page 2 of my book. That's just, something's wrong about that, Brian. I just don't understand. No, I'm kidding. Listen, great to have you here. I want to go back, if you don't mind. I want to start with, we did your introduction. I'd like to turn to Genesis 1 and 2. It's chapter 2 in your book, Creation as Foundational to God's Torah. And I started to do this one at a time, frankly, and that was before I really had a chance to get in and read the book. It's because it's a brand new book, yes. And it just recently came out. And as I read, I just realized, man, I have some. This is really, really good stuff that I really probably didn't do a good job in talking with you on. So we're gonna hopefully no one saw the other one. This is a whole redo, okay? But your second chapter, Genesis, creation as a foundation to God's Torah, and really you go through here, and you talk. I mean, you have got some things that I just couldn't let pass. Some things that I never thought of. Not that would be important, probably other people have, but I mean some of the observations that you make about the way that God through Moses tells his story, this creation story, is just absolutely phenomenal. And that's where you start, is with creation as a foundation for truth. And one of the things you talk about is you say one could note the obvious interconnectedness of creation of the sun, moon, stars for appointed seasons, a precursor to the appointed times of Israel's feasts. Even the ordering of creation into kinds, which prepares the reader for various food laws. I'd never thought of that, to be honest with you. But I came down to where you're talking about the instruction of the 10 Commandments. And that's where I thought, boy, this is just great things. And from a pastoral standpoint, boy, I wish I would have had your book in my hand years ago when I was talking about Genesis. You start with parallels between creation and the 10 Commandments. I just want to see if you could share your thinking on this. And you begin with Commandment 1 and 2, and no gods before him, and no idols. Yeah. Could you just kind of start unpacking a little bit of that?
Yeah, I start in this particular chapter dealing with the text itself, as you know, in Genesis 1. Well, 1 and 2, but 1 in particular, where if the 10 Commandments are the basis of the Torah, and I often say that you have those 10 laws, and from those 10 laws, it's kind of unpacked in the rest of of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you're dealing with that, what is the very first commandment? It has to do with God's singularity, has to do with having no other gods before him. So what do we see in the very opening chapter of Genesis chapter 1? The book of Genesis, chapter 1, you have this presentation of God, in the beginning God, singularity, in the sense of he is alone. What is it that Moses, I think, is trying to get across to his audience in light of where they came from and where they're going? Well, if they're coming from an Egyptian context, there are 3 main creator deities, and I think you'll probably talk a little bit about this later. Yeah. And from a Mesopotamian perspective, there are a number of creator deities, one being Tiamat, Marduk, after he killed Tiamat. Well, in these ancient creation myths, a lot of them are conflict, and it's based and rooted in idolatry. I mean, this idea that you worship these gods, these other gods. And so what you see in Genesis chapter 1 is there is no other God other than Yahweh. identified as Elohim, which, and I argue in my book why I think he's using Elohim as opposed to Yahweh, in order to appeal to a very broad audience, and much in the same way we would use the term God today, as opposed to Jesus, or as opposed to Jesus Christ or the Christ.
But and that's true. And I hadn't. That was something that that caught my attention too, because of. And I know I'm kind of jumping ahead, but I was so excited about it because I went back and I read that again, because there's another part in here, not too far ahead, without giving it all away. You use two names of God and show how that does it. But you talk about how this inclusiveness of the nations as you go through is a theme all the way through here. And when you mentioned that, I thought that was fascinating, how God. How the writer used that name of God for that reason.
Absolutely. Exodus, I believe, is in chapter 12, where it talks about there was a great mixed multitude that come out of Egypt with the Israelites. Well, what would they know? The language that they would know, for the most part, is this generic term for God. And so he is saying, in the beginning, God is creating, but then by chapter 2, he identifies who that God is. It's one of the only places in the entire Old Testament where you have a compound name for God, where it's Yahweh Elohim, where they're put together, and it's almost exclusively in chapters 2 and 3, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's so you mentioned that right from the very beginning. You mentioned that Israel's God stands alone and creates alone, which would have been a shocker for any culture, outside of the Israelites or outside of the Hebrews. There, that was a that would have been a bolt of truth out of, from heaven.
Yeah, it's very much a monotheistic faith. And that's why scholars for so long have struggled with the fact that there's no possible way that this is Mosaic. And so they ascribe chapter 1, for example, to what this fictionary, or fictitious, I should say, priestly author.
Yeah.
Totally theoretical. And I'm not saying that priests could not have edited or done work on that. That's not what I'm saying. But attributing an entire block of this material to a priestly source, that's why they're doing it, because they're saying, well, this has to be late. It's so monotheistic. Yeah. And there's no way that Israel was monotheistic at that early stage. And so that's where scholarship has gone with that chapter 1. But I'm saying, look, if it's Mosaic and if he is truly a worshiper of Yahweh, even though he may have grown up in a polytheistic setting, he is trying to establish monotheism.
Right. Now, actually, you mentioned something about Moses. Moses would have been familiar with all of the mythology, because he, of course, grew up in the king's household, right?
Yeah.
So he would have had the very best of what the Egyptians would have considered the best learning, the best education, and so he obviously. Was setting through the work of the Holy Spirit, setting the record straight, because he was familiar with all the myths and all the ridiculous life action that caused, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's I often put it this way, that Moses had the Ivy League or the Harvard training of his day in the house of Pharaoh. He would have had the best of understanding.
It may have been worth about what the same thing at Harvard. No,
sorry. Well, I mean, yes, relatively speaking, of what they're being taught.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that they've even found in ancient Egypt, in some of the archives there, I think at Tel el-Amarna, where they've actually found Mesopotamian literature. So this stuff was being disseminated. It's just not in Mesopotamia, but even Egypt was collecting this literature, and no doubt using it in their educational process. And so there's no question that Moses would have been exposed to that at some point, if he's being trained in the house of Pharaoh,
right.
Especially if his stepmom, or his adopted mom, is Hatshepsut.
Yeah, so. And that actually, you caught my attention on some comments about the sun and the moon. You say, and I wish I had thought of this, but it's almost like there's this I don't want to say dissing going on, but there's no, he doesn't even call him by name,
right?
And that would have been a complete slap in the face of those other cultures that worshipped them.
Absolutely.
I mean, and believed that they were gods, right?
Yeah, I mean, you have in Hebrew the term is Shemesh for the sun, Yariach for the moon. What's interesting is in ancient Babylonian literature, their sun god was called Shamash, just a variation of that, but the same root. And in ancient Ugarit, it was Yarik, which is, again, a derivative of Yariak. And so the fact that he refuses to call him Yariak or Yariak and Shemesh or Shamash, he's actually using the greater light and the lesser light.
Yeah.
He won't even list them by name, because he doesn't want the Israelites to think that Yahweh or Elohim has actually created the lesser deities. That was the thinking of the ancient world.
Yeah, I found it kind of again pretty interesting that you mentioned in there that even that is kind of contrary, because it does say the sun's the greater light and the lesser light. Yep. But I think in Egyptian, was it Egyptian or Canaanite culture, or in their mythology, the moon had been the greater, had birthed the sun or something.
Yeah.
And
in certain myths, in the Mesopotamian myths, that they actually have the moon as being greater. And even that he undermines.
Yeah.
So
I wish, again, I wish I would have had this in hand, because now I look at it, I go, wow, Moses is just, along with obviously sharing God's truth, it's almost like I'm looking at him laughing while he mocks the ridiculous and fantastical lengths that people will go to pervert the truth, and it is a perversion of truth. Obviously, because Adam had passed on all of this, the creation account and his relationship with God and all of that, and all the way down through there, that that people knew the truth. They just suppressed the truth in unrighteousness, and satanic lies just kind of filled the void, and and things like that. Just like we have all sorts of wherever you go in the world, you've got those the flood mythology, but it's always really corrupted, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I just thought that was interesting that and I would say that, again, I'm speaking from a pastoral standpoint, how important it is to once again believe that God's word is true, and as your chapter says, it is the foundation for truth. Absolutely. This whole creation area, especially when it's under attack as it is today. Yep. You come to well, actually, I made a note here just on the side where it's, God's God and you're not, and nor is any aspect of creation God. And man, we need to get a grip on that today. Yep. This whole idea that everyone is their own God, and the environment is God, Mother Nature, is somehow some independent living force that's intelligent force that's directing either evolution or reacting to man on the planet. Boy, how much do we have to get back to that? On commandment, so you come to commandment 3.
Yes.
And you talk about the author's use of divine names. And each of this is where we were talking about. This is where he first puts together, I guess, the two names, correct?
Yes.
And you touched on that, but would you just share the significance of that again in terms of the commandment about not taking the name of the Lord in vain, and also the inclusive part of that?
Yeah, the fact that, as I noted in chapter 1, he is using a very generic term for God, and by chapter 3 or by commandment 3, they're not to take the Lord's name in vain. You have this understanding of who this Elohim is, very distinct. Understanding of who he is, and like I said, from chapter 2 onward into chapter 3, you have this use of that Yahweh Elohim language, and it's to identify and show the sanctity of who that Elohim, who that.
Well, that's
God
what I was
is.
going to ask you, Brian. What would be your definition of taking the name of Lord in vain? Because I don't know if we really give that too much thought today. We kind of know it in passing. How would you define that, or what would be the way that you would discuss that with people?
I think what the best way to do is to start from the ancient perspective first. What did it mean to take the Lord's name in vain? Most of the time, it was to take an oath or swear in the name of your deity, and have no intent on keeping it or breaking it in some way.
Okay.
And that way, the name of the Lord is belittled in the eyes of the people, and continually, or the eyes of the nation. And continually, you see this. Moses brings this up before God when God wants to destroy the children of Israel, especially after Exodus 32. He said, "The people will hear about this, and your name will be, profaned."
Right.
And so do it for the sake of your holy name. Ezekiel does this in chapter 20. For the sake of my holy name, God says, I'm going to do this. And so in the ancient world, it is the taking and belittling of the name. How does that happen? Do we take oaths per se? Well, you could argue let's take marriage covenant. You stand in the presence of, for Christians who stand in the presence of God and take an oath, and they break it. Is that in some way taken? We don't think that way, do we?
Right.
Because most of the times what we think of, we're swearing or using foul language or taking God's name and corrupting it in our language. And I think that is important, not to take God's name vainly that way. And make an oath that way, but I think more so it can be the way we live. If we take on the name of Christ, we are Christians. We can
It would almost have a sense then of moving into another form of covenantal identification today, being baptized with no intention of actually following or obeying or trying to take on the identity of Jesus Christ. Then
absolutely.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of different perspectives on that, but the way I see it, it's more than just using God's name in a very callous or loose way.
Right.
I think it's more even the way we live.
Yeah.
And because for the ancients, that's the way they would have understood it. Ezekiel chapter 17 is probably one of the clearest examples of this, where you have what appears to be Zedekiah profaning the name of God, Yahweh, because he had sworn an oath to Nebuchadnezzar and had gone back on it. And most scholars believe that's exactly what's going on there. And God takes him to task for that. He's basically taking God's name in vain, and you're not following through with what you say you're going to do.
Okay, and so we get the first inclination of that right in the first part of the creation story, and
the importance of the divine name.
Genesis, I should say.
Absolutely.
And so we'll just and if you want to add anything, I'm just going to kind of quickly go through these.
Okay.
But you have the third commandment, or going over the commandment for the Sabbath.
Yes.
Really a great section on here. Moses using God's resting at the end of the creation week as a means of justifying the Sabbath day rest for Israel. The Sabbath is a sign of the covenant at Sinai. I guess people are just going to have to read the book, okay? Because we're going to be doing a little bit of fast covering this, and there's so much here. And so you definitely have to go out and get the book to work along with this. But you talk about how unique this is. The Sabbath day is unique. There's nothing else in all the world. That might not have been the words, but I mean, it was like there's nothing else comparable to a Sabbath.
Yes.
And that occurs right at the very beginning.
Yeah, I mean, by the end of kind of the first creation narrative, it's actually in chapter 2. Because the first creation narrative actually bleeds over into chapter 2 on day 7. What is interesting is that no other ancient text that we have found seems to give this clear understanding that they were to take a break. But yet here is God creating the world, and he has established the human body is made to take a break.
Right.
And that's why you have consistently individuals in the ancient world who were slaves who would die at a very young age. I mean, they were being worked to death. And what's interesting is God actually requires Israel to allow not only themselves to take a break, but their animals to take a break, their servants to take a break. Everybody has to come to a screeching, everything has to come to a screeching halt. And it was so the body and the animals could be refreshed. And he establishes right here the opening of creation. Yeah,
in fact, I made a note. I was struck by the comprehensive aspect of that, and it was, you'd written that people, animals, strangers in the land, the fields of Israel, having those Sabbath years, and even a double one in the 50th year, and things like that. I was thinking that's there is definitely a noble part of work. It's a good calling. I mean, today we have a lot of people that try to escape work. They think that their whole goal is to become rich enough, maybe, so that they don't work. But that's not the way the Bible sees it. The Bible clearly says 6 days you shall labor, right? But it is done in such a way that it's an enjoyable thing. It's not something that, and I would think, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but I would think that having that seventh day as a rest would keep you, like you said, you get to rest, but it kind of recharges you so that you're, again, looking forward to going back to work rather than dreading it then.
Yes.
So that it keeps that work fresh and exciting and you enjoy it.
Yeah.
And then that Sabbath day where you can rest and take time off and kind of recharge. And so it just brings the joy of the Lord into the whole process.
Yeah, I mean, originally that was God's plan before the fall, obviously, before
Yeah.
weeds and thistles, and now work becomes toilsome. But for the most part, even Adam and Eve, when they go into the garden, the term that's used there is that they were to work. In Hebrew, they were to work the garden. Work is not a bad thing. It's not, as we often say, a four-letter word. It's actually a four-letter word that's good. So in this case, I think that what God was trying to get across to the people is work is fine, but it has to be done in such a way that you do take that break. And like I said, from the very inception, that's what we say.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit out of line here. I was just looking for it, and I know I'm probably jumping ahead, but there's a place that you contrast the productivity of Eden and what would have spread out of there with the famines in the land that would strike later on. In fact, it would actually drive the Hebrews into Egypt originally, right?
Yes. Yeah, well, that's
I
part
know
of
I'm
the
jumping
fall.
ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. I'm jumping, but
I think it's over in chapter 3 where we talk
is it?
about the
Okay.
fall.
Sorry.
Yes, and the fact that part of the curse upon humanity was the curse of the land. The land doesn't produce anymore.
the work that was going in was going to be. I mean,
Wasn't
so they
yielding.
and so they would really need rest in that case.
Yeah.
And so God was gracious.
It becomes even more toilsome.
Okay,
Absolutely.
yeah. So then you move on. You've got honor your father and your mother in here, and that doesn't. I mean, I can see that, and of course, that's an important law that is all the way through. I mean, Paul in the New Testament, Paul says that's the first commandment with promise.
Absolutely.
And so there's some great benefits right from the very beginning. You mentioned the honoring of the father and mother, but then you also tie that into some of the marriage, perhaps some of the marriage laws and our actions in life. Where do you fit that in?
Okay, that comes in chapter 2, verse 24 of Genesis, where you have a father and mother. The man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. Well, at this point, it's just Adam and Eve. But the law is being established of what the family structure is supposed to look like. Ultimately, you have one man, one woman coming together.
Yeah.
And while you honor your father and your mother, and I am a firm believer of this myself, even after you can leave the house, you are still to honor. But at the end of the day, you are to make a new family unit and start raising children. And those children are to honor you as father and mother. And so what God is trying to do, I believe, through Moses in chapter 2, is to show what culture is supposed to look like, the establishment of society. Honoring one's father and mother is key. But at the end of the day, you are still your own household once you get married.
You become one flesh.
You become one flesh.
And as you point out, that elevates both the man and the woman, but especially the woman.
Yeah.
But you also, it's kind of interesting because there's definitely a regulation, as you say, of the parents.
Yes.
To not second-rate status, but at least secondary, because the husband clings to the wife to the husband, and your direction is with them. And so there's I think that you put it that means that, hey, listen, in-laws are great. Yeah. But there is a reason that there has to be some separation there.
Absolutely.
You can't have the in-laws or the outlaws, whatever it is, running the place. Right. It's got to be a real husband and wife unit from there forward, right?
Yeah. Stop and consider how revolutionary this was in a patriarchal setting, where in patriarchy normally the wife goes to the house of the husband. And what Moses is doing is trying to say that, that may be patriarchy, but technically you're still supposed to be one unit in the sense of a husband and wife. I often think of My Big Fat Greek Wedding, the movie, where he buys the house next door so his daughter can be there. That's very much that culture, and we've seen this from the ancient perspective was very much the same culture, and this is it's countercultural to what they would have been like in that patriarchal setting.
Huh.
Read the story of Jacob and Laban. I mean, Laban is basically controlling everything.
Yeah.
And what does Jacob try to do? Taking his wives and getting out of there.
Out of there, yeah.
So he can establish his own family.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. And actually, you mentioned a good point there. I hadn't really thought, but you actually point out that there is Isaac and Esau actually do. I'm sorry, not Isaac. Jacob and Esau reconcile at the end. And most of the time, there's not that happy ending between the conflicts. Yes. But in that one, there was. You get down in Commandment 6 and through 10. You touch on thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not covet, bear false witness. All of these things, of course, that's the 10 Commandments, which are going to come much later. Yeah. But you find to even call them seed wouldn't do it justice. You find the foundations of those laws right there, built in to the very fabric of the culture and of the commands of God.
The commands of God. Yeah, I mean, you're going to already see by chapter 3, when you get over chapter 3, a lot of these are going to now start to come into play, especially with the fall. But there's no question when you have God as the foundation of everything that you are doing. If you murder, you strike out against, for example, an individual, that is striking out against the image of God. Well, where's that seed planted? In Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 28, where you have God creating in His image, and of course in Genesis 9, this is going to be picked up. After the flood, one of the commands that is given to Noah in the Noahic covenant is they are to anybody who kills another man, his life shall be forfeit. Why? Because you're striking against the image of God.
Yeah, actually, I'm kind of going to jump back a little bit to the very beginning where you're talking about how there is God and then there's no images. Yes. But you point out rightly that. That what it does is it means that there's only really one image of God on earth, right? Yes. And that's man. Because He fashions him. He says we're going to make man in our image. And so I would think that right from the very beginning, I mean, the strike against the image of God. I mean, Cain definitely knows that's wrong. I mean, nobody had to say, hey, Cain, really. That wasn't really, you weren't supposed to do that. Yeah. He'd go, well, where was law? I mean, he knew it, right? I mean, it's the law is in your heart. I mean, it's built into that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. You get over to chapter 3 and 4 after the fall, in chapter 4 with Cain and Abel, that Cain knows. Yeah. Because God is to call him to task for that. He said, don't you know if you do well, things will go well for you? Yeah. And he said, you have to be careful because sin is crouching at the door. And this is the idea is he recognizes that the desire is for that sin to take him over, and he must master. So he knows what he's doing is not right.
Yeah. And then, of course, by the time Lamech kills someone, he's bragging about it. I mean, he's not denying it. He's out there saying, hey, I'm going to sing a song. I'm celebrating this. I mean, man, how perverted is that? So we have that, and then we have you give by the way, you give several examples on the deal with adultery and coveting, and then bearing false witness. All of that is right there. So that is I just as I went through this, I thought, man, this is really again, when sometimes when we talk about Genesis, we only scratch the surface. There's so much there, and not only is it there, but knowing that, I mean, it helps us in so many ways throughout the rest of Scripture. You go, wow, okay, well, I see that. I see that it's not just popping out of nowhere, or it's not coming without a foreshadowing way back here, and so we're just seeing a fuller extension or revelation of this. Yes. Yeah, it's just really. And then here's what I have to tell you. This is really what kind of flipped my switch. All of this stuff does. Genesis. I love Genesis. Yeah. I love but you have really touched on this inclusiveness, this important aspect of all nations. Yeah. Right from the very beginning, God is concerned. Yes, He's going to come and He's going to create a people, Israel. Yes. But in here, you're going to say, hey, listen, there's a lot of other people that are grafted into this that we don't even think about, right? Yeah. And it's, this is like Jesus comes and said, I'm sending you out to all the nations. Yep. I want you to reach all of them. Or Isaiah, talking to the nations, like God knew them, and He did know them personally. Yep. Yep. And but it starts out here, and I really like the way that you laid the foundation for this. And it, I'm just thinking, boy, what a powerful foundation for for the gospel, that mission outreach that we have that's laid in right here.
Yes.
And you start by saying that God immediately starts grafting people in, right?
Yeah, from the earliest time. I mean, the Jewish people, the Israelite people, are obviously not going to be identified until the seed of Abraham. But Genesis 1-11, what a lot of people fail to recognize, even though it is Torah for the Jewish people, it is really directed at the nations. This is people argue, well, that's Torah, that's Jewish. That the Old Testament is Bible for them, but it's not for us. And I beg to differ. I mean, you look at Genesis 1-11; it's establishing for all people, all nations. Yeah. And for example, something as controversial as capital punishment, where do you actually see it? Genesis chapter 9. And it's for all people. It's not just Israel.
Right,
this is pre-Israel. And that's why I find it interesting that you have every one of the ancient laws, law codes at some point deal with murder. And almost inevitably it is capital punishment is what is the mandate. Why? Because God has established it. Because Israel was to be a light to the nations. Their law that they have here, the Torah, was supposed to be good for not only them but the nations. And so they take this, and the problem is, of course, the Israelites failed miserably for the most part. It was Christ who ultimately lives out the law perfectly.
Right. And it's and I would say, and I'm going to speak on my behalf, but as I read through this, I'm just thinking about how so often Christians were under the New Testament. Definitely the New Testament dispensation. The gospel is glorious. We're under grace, not under law. But there's never been a time in the history of the world, or I don't think in any place, whether it's on heaven or on earth, that God has not had laws. Yeah. They precede the Ten Commandments. They may have been codified there, but like you say, they're already in existence before the law, and they're in existence after. In fact, today the Word of God would say that the law used to be written in stone. Now it's written on your heart. Right. So the law is established. So we find that all of these here. Now there may be changes. I was thinking about the food laws that you said. But God still has food laws. I mean, at the Lord's table. Yes. For instance, there's still that dividing. I mean, between the table of demons and the table in God's table. Yes. There's still God still uses food in a sense to mark His people, to show them way. And again, it would be at the Lord's table with the bread and the wine. Yes. But there's still those aspects of that. Of what came from the old are definitely in effect, maybe in a transformed way. I think of what Paul, would take. He would look and he'd say, listen, you need to pay your ministers, and in fact a double portion. And he took that from a law, so it must still be in effect. He just extrapolated out and said, hey, you think that they were just talking about, you don't muzzle the ox that treads out the grain? I'm telling you that not only that, but what that means is that here you have people laboring in the Word, and so that law applies today. So there's definitely a Spirit-infused expansion. Yes. And without saying that a lot of those have not expired or that they haven't went away, but law is, in fact, I think that you would agree with this. Law is important today, right? Yep. So we don't dare ignore the Torah, and we don't dare ignore Genesis as Torah.
Yeah, I mean that's part of the.
I'm getting him in trouble, and I just want I'm speaking for myself.
It's part of my instruction to students is I spend a lot of time of how we actually apply this.
Yeah.
Because there are what is often called one-for-one laws, where you can read it and thou shalt not kill. Guess what? Today thou shalt not kill.
Right.
The problem and people usually don't have a problem with those ones. It's when you get to those more ancillary laws and maybe those laws on sexuality and whatnot. That's the ones they start pushing back on. Right. And I say, look, the texts are very clear. No question, there's going to be ones that are related to Israel, how they relate to God in maybe an occultic setting. But there's still a principle there. Right. God is holy. You approach Him as a holy God, and how dare we ignore those laws?
Right. They were types and shadows of what was going to.
Absolutely. Right. And so we need to, and that's why part of the purpose of writing this book was actually to get people thinking about the narratives and the laws and how they may still apply today.
Well, Brian, let's go back to this inclusive part. You mentioned people right away that are a part of. I mean, you talk about the mixed multitude, obviously. I think you even talk about Bathsheba
Yes.
in a place. There's some other areas and of course, if people were circumcised, they could have been brought in.
Yes.
And obviously we know that there was other. In fact, I think what surprised me, and I didn't know this was that this was true. I'm sorry I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this. I didn't know that God brought the Canaanites in.
And some of them, Rahab.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah.
Rahab.
And yeah, that's right. That's where the Canaanites. And of course, there were some places where they were pretty bad. Yeah. And he would say that, before you can serve in the temple, which was kind of their form of citizenship, they have to be, it takes 2 generations. Another group was so bad that it would take 5. I think one was like it took 10 generations or something. And so you see these ways that they can become encultured and brought in into the covenant and into the life of Israel and be a part of that.
Yeah, I mean, again, not to go off on a tangent, but one of the misconceptions of the conquest is that that was all genocide and there was no chance for the Canaanites. I think the case of Rahab and her entire family is a good example of extending grace. Of course, the Gibeonites do it through trickery, but at the end of the day, they are brought into the service of the temple.
Yeah.
In a servant or slave, however you want to look at it, but they still had rights within the nation of Israel.
In fact, David goes and defends them. I mean, at one point, God says, "Go take care of those people," right? Yeah. Because they had been covenantally faithful.
Yeah. Both Joshua and David come to the aid of the Gibeonites.
Right. So that's an important because you're right. It's not, even though we think of it only as a Jewish history. Yeah. Really, it's way past Abraham before it becomes Jewish history. Yeah, I mean, it's through his son, that the seed comes. But Abraham, and then of course with Abraham, you see him meeting Melchizedek, who offers him the bread and the wine, and they worship. You find all of this. You find all of this going on, and while the covenant, the covenantal promise may come through Abraham, but then actually through Isaac, and descendants, really all the way up till then, the whole world, is being represented, I guess you'd say.
Absolutely.
So that's exciting stuff. Now you have a whole on chapter 1. You have quite a bit more that I'm not going to touch on. They're just going to have to go and read it. But the creation narratives, the second part of that we've kind of touched on. But we're going to let them go do that on their own. Yeah. I just wanted, because the book is called Genesis is Torah, and there's such outstanding examples, and then the way that you pull that out is just so important and plays an important aspect in everything that we go from here on. I really wanted to cover that. Is there anything else that you want to talk about in terms of that we've missed, or that I've perhaps cut you off on in my excitement?
No, I think that you're right. There's a lot of information that I give, especially when I put Genesis 1 and 2 in the context of ancient Egypt. I think there's more evidence in these opening chapters of Genesis that pushes in the direction of Mosaic authorship, or at least someone who's very familiar with Egyptian mythology, that he is trying to correct. Yeah. And I think that if the readers read that portion, I think it'll be quite enlightening.
Brian, why does, let me just ask you a question, because it's only been the last 200 years that the Mosaic authorship has really been questioned. Nobody questioned that before.
There was the odd person early, 16th, 17th century, but that was the oddity, or would be classified as an oddity.
But in terms of Jewish scholars, the Orthodox Jewish rabbis, they would have ascribed that to Moses, right?
Yes.
For the most part, and maybe now that of course, there's not a lot of faithfulness in even Orthodox Jewish circles today, but the early Christians certainly, Jesus ascribed that stuff to Moses.
Yeah, it's all the early
Did
writers.
Jesus not know what he was talking about?
Well, the argument is this is the way it's put forward, and this is what I think is scary. They would argue, well, Jesus and Paul are speaking as first century men.
Yeah.
And so that's the tradition. Of course, that's the way they're trained, and so they're only speaking what they know.
Yeah.
I still have that struggle with you're saying that these inspired authors, especially the Son of Man, doesn't know who actually is the author of this material.
Yeah, the God who created him in the beginning.
Gave the law.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it just informed him, and the same Spirit who breathed life into Adam and inspired Moses. And by the same power that raised Christ from the dead now dwells in him. None of that could have any effect, of course.
Yeah.
So.
Of course, they would argue that
Now
there may be nuggets.
I feel like I'm Moses mocking the sun and moon god.
Yeah.
So,
in all fairness, some of the scholars probably would argue that there were maybe nuggets that were Mosaic, but it's got so much that is accrued around it. And what I argue, and again, this is the difference between minimalists and maximalists. The minimalists who believe, the minimum amount of the Bible is history versus a maximalist who believes, that it's history. What I try to do as a maximalist is I try to give pastors and students I don't want to say ammunition, but the apologetic to be able to look at this material and say, hey, there is another side to look at this. And I think it works well in a Mosaic context.
Well, I think I think it is ammunition. I mean, the Bible clearly speaks in militaristic terms about pulling down all those, vain philosophies that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God, and tearing down all those walls, and so I'm happy using militaristic terms. I think we need to get back to some of that stuff. But hey, Brian, thank you. I appreciate you. I appreciate you taking time to walk us through that. And again, really, even our conversation does not do justice to what pastors or any reader will get by taking the book, because you definitely go through this systematically, where I've been jumping back and forth, and you've been gracious to answer these questions. But you've done just a marvelous job of laying this out in very clear terms, and it is eye-opening. And to be honest with you, I've studied Genesis. I can't tell you the number of books I have, and there was fresh insights and different things that I just kept saying. I just had several wow moments, and I thought, I wish I'd have had that. I kept thinking back to sermons, out whether in Genesis or out, that I kept thinking, man, I wish I would have had this. It was just something that just struck me, and so they definitely need to pick up your book. So,
appreciate that.
Thank you.